She's a published scientist and healthcare educator, but more importantly, she has created an indelible footprint in the healthcare world with her podcast, her YouTube channel, and her website of the name Found My Fitness, where she tells people about the things they don't know they need. Her focus is on things like micronutrition deficiencies and their role in aging and in gut health. She's one of the leaders in the United States and, in fact, in the world in personalized nutrition and the genetics of inter-individual differences in response to diet, lifestyle, and gut health. She's been published in journals all over the world, like Experimental Gerontology, Nature Cell Biology, Trends in Cell Biology. I could go on and on. She's also one of the leading contributors to the Fatty Acid Research Institution, focusing on brain aging. And her work in fields like gut permeability and exposing the body to hormetic stress effects and to hormetic stressors and their effects on depression and stress reactions are absolutely some of the best in the world and are changing the world around her in leaps and bounds. So, ladies and gentlemen, I know you're going to be floored by this next guest, so put your hands together for Dr. Rhonda Patrick.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Okay, before we get started, let's do a selfie. What do you think? Can we get all together and excited? Maybe throw your hands up. Okay, ready? Okay, throw your hands up. Woo! Wait, it's on video. That's not right. Okay, here we go. One more time. Woo! All right. Okay, so thanks for that great introduction, and also big thanks to everyone for coming, and hope you guys are really enjoying this conference. I'm sorry I missed some of the speakers yesterday. I'm sure it was amazing. Today we're going to talk about some of the powerful tools that I think that we have at our disposal right now, yesterday, to improve the way we age. And so we're going to talk about just a few. There we go. We're going to talk about just a few of the things that I think that are sort of big bang for your buck. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about some micronutrient deficiencies and insufficiencies that are very common, focusing on vitamin D, magnesium, omega-3. And then we're going to get into exercise, and this is where I think this is the most powerful thing you can do for the way you age, for longevity, for your brain health. We're going to talk specifically about vigorous exercise. We're going to get into a lot of stuff there, the brain, cancer, exercise snacks. And then we're going to get a little bit into sleep and optimizing good sleep and why that's really important. We're going to focus on metabolic health, but sleep is very important for brain health, for immune health, for cardiovascular health, for everything. So that's kind of what's coming up today. And I'm going to start with micronutrients. There's actually a lot of widespread micronutrient deficiencies. So micronutrients are about 30 or so essential vitamins and minerals, trace elements, fatty acids. Today we're going to focus on 3 that are pretty prevalent in terms of their widespread deficiency amongst the US population, but also 3 that are really, I think, important in terms of regulating the aging process. So let's start with vitamin D. Many of you are probably already aware of the fact that vitamin D deficiency and insufficiency is very common. About 70% of the US population is not getting adequate levels of vitamin D, which is about 30 nanograms per milliliter. That's combined deficiency and insufficiency. So deficiency would be 20 nanograms per milliliter or less. About 30%, almost 30% of the population is vitamin D deficient, where another 40% is vitamin D insufficient. Now, vitamin D is actually a steroid hormone. It's not just a vitamin. And what does that mean? Well, a steroid hormone basically goes into the nucleus of your cell and it interacts with DNA. And vitamin D specifically recognizes a certain sequence called a vitamin D response element that's present in more than 5% of the protein encoding human genome. It's a lot of genes. It turns genes on, activates them so they make proteins. It does the opposite. It also turns them off. But it regulates, over 1,000 genes, and many of these genes are involved in longevity. So for example, it's activating klotho gene. So klotho is all the rage right now in the longevity sphere. This gene is activated by vitamin D, and it plays a big role in healthy brain aging. It protects against Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Like I said, it's a big focus of investigation right now in the longevity field. Vitamin D also activates TERT. This is an enzyme that helps rebuild our telomere. So our telomeres are protecting our DNA and our chromosomes. It activates superoxide dismutase. This is a very powerful antioxidant playing a role in mitochondrial health, and on and on. And so you can imagine if you are deficient in vitamin D or you are insufficient, then these genes that are supposed to be regulated by vitamin D are not being regulated properly. And so, dysfunction can occur, and it's a problem that can build up sort of this insidious damage over time. It's not necessarily something that's going to happen tomorrow, but a decade, 2 decades later, as you continue to be vitamin D insufficient or deficient, that's where the diseases of aging start to crop up. There's a lot of reasons why vitamin D deficiency is widespread. So vitamin D3 is made in our skin. Many of you already know this. UVB radiation is required to make vitamin D3 in our skin, and that's then released in the bloodstream and converted into 25-hydroxy vitamin D, the major circulating form, and then into the steroid hormone. Well, anything that blocks UVB radiation is going to stop us from making vitamin D3. So for one, we spend less time outside. We're mostly indoors at our computer, in our cubicles, working. 100 years ago, we were outside all the time. Sunscreen, so many of us are aware of skin aging, like myself, or skin cancer, and so we wear sunscreen. Well, that blocks vitamin D3 production. Melanin, the natural sunscreen that many people have that gives them darker pigmentation. It's an adaptation to live more towards equatorial regions where you need the natural sunscreen. Well, that also blocks UVB radiation. And so there's a study out of the University of Chicago that actually compared African Americans living in Chicago, which is a more northern latitude. So that's another thing that regulates vitamin D3 production. UVB radiation doesn't hit the atmosphere certain months of the year in more northern latitudes. So in Chicago, African Americans have to spend 6 to 10 times longer in the sun to make the same amount of vitamin D3 as someone with fair skin. Big study out of the University of Chicago. That's a lot of time that they have to spend in the sun longer to make the same amount of vitamin D3. Body fat's also a regulator, so vitamin D3 is fat soluble. It has to be released into the bloodstream to be converted into the steroid hormone, and higher body fat actually causes the bioavailability of vitamin D to be reduced by as much as 50%. So that's also another regulator. And then age. So as we get older, our bodies are less effective and efficient at producing vitamin D3 from the sun. So a lot of factors that are contributing to this vitamin D deficiency and insufficiency prevalence. So let's talk about the role in aging. I want to start with a rodent study because, the pictures are so stark. So vitamin D binds to a vitamin D receptor, and that's how it sort of goes into the nucleus to regulate genes. Well, these animals on the left, these mice, have their vitamin D receptor gone, knocked out. Those mice on the top panel are the same age, right there. There's a wild type and then the vitamin D receptor knockout. And then 4 months later, you can see the vitamin D receptor knockout. It's an accelerated aging model. So after 4 months, these animals their bones are brittle. Their immune system dysregulation, their skin, they look terrible, right? Well, that's mice. So the question is, what about humans? So in order to look at how vitamin D may regulate the aging process in humans, we turn to Mendelian randomization studies. So Mendelian randomization is a way to use genetics to look at how a risk factor, in this case vitamin D deficiency, affects an outcome. So in this case, we're looking at all-cause mortality, cancer mortality, cardiovascular related mortality. And the reason that it's used is because people have genes that regulate their conversion of vitamin D3 into the steroid hormone. Some people don't do it as well. And so it's a way of sort of randomizing people based on their genetics that have low vitamin D. And it's great because when you do observational data and you're just measuring vitamin D levels, the criticism is, well, people that have low vitamin D also spend less time in the sun, they're less physically active, they're generally unhealthy. And so you kind of eliminate that possibility, and it's more of a way of looking at this data like a randomized controlled trial. And so people that have genetically low vitamin D levels have a higher all-cause mortality than people that do not have genetically low vitamin D levels, and they have a higher cancer-related mortality than people that do not have low vitamin D levels. So vitamin D seems to be also regulating the aging process in humans as well. And there was a randomized controlled trial that was done. It was over the course of about a few weeks. It took people that were very deficient in vitamin D, so these are the 20 nanograms per milliliter and below group, gave them a vitamin D supplement of 4,000 IUs a day. That is the upper tolerable limit for vitamin D, and gave it to them for several weeks and measured their biological age via epigenetic aging, the Horvath clock that measures methylation patterns in DNA, which is a marker for DNA aging, corresponds more to your biological age than your chronological age. And the vitamin D supplementation was able to reverse epigenetic aging in these people by almost 2 years after just a course of a few weeks. So again, not having sufficient levels of vitamin D may be accelerating the aging process and making you more susceptible to diseases like cancer, also respiratory diseases as well. So how do you know if you are getting enough vitamin D? Well, again, we already talked about this. You want to get a blood test. You can't change what you don't know. So a vitamin D blood test is one of the easiest and cheapest tests you can do. You want to make sure you're at least in the adequate range, which is above 30 nanograms per mil. There's a variety of studies that have looked at observational data, looking at vitamin D levels and all-cause mortality, and it seems like the sweet spot is 30 nanograms per mil to 60 nanograms per milliliter in terms of lowest all-cause mortality. Vitamin D is fat-soluble. If you megadose on it, it can have toxic effects, particularly hypercalcemia, so high calcium levels, although that takes a lot of vitamin D. I mean, there's been studies that even people taking 10,000 IUs a day for over a year, they don't have hypercalcemia. So you really have to overdo it to get to that level, but it is important to keep that in mind. Typically, for someone who is deficient, 1,000 IUs of vitamin D can raise blood levels by around 5, sometimes 10 nanograms per milliliter, depending again on their genetic makeup. And so you just have to get a test. You have to get a test after supplementation to make sure you're taking the right dose. Really the most important way to figure out how much vitamin D you need to supplement with. Okay, so I want to switch to magnesium. Magnesium is another micronutrient that a lot of people are not getting enough of. So actually, the statistics have changed on this. Almost 65% of the US population has inadequate magnesium intake. So the RDA for women is around 320 mg a day, and for men, it's around 420 milligrams of magnesium a day. If you are athletic, that number can go up between 10 to 20%, depending on your level of athleticism. So elite athletes that are sweating a lot, they're sweating magnesium out, they actually can require up to 20% more than the RDA. Magnesium is it's easier to eliminate deficiency from diet. Vitamin D, not so much. Not a lot of foods are high in vitamin D3. So magnesium is at the center of a chlorophyll molecule. Chlorophyll give plants their green color. So dark leafy greens are a great source of magnesium. A lot of people are not eating enough dark leafy greens, which is why so many people are getting insufficient magnesium. Magnesium is a cofactor for over 300 enzymes in your body. It is running metabolism, everything from neurotransmitter synthesis to immune function to repairing DNA damage, and this is a big one. So DNA damage is happening all the time. It's happening right now in all of us, and our body has incredible repair systems where we can repair that damage so that we don't get a potential oncogenic mutation that could eventually lead to cancer. When you don't have those DNA repair enzymes working properly because they don't have their cofactor, then DNA repair doesn't happen. And so over the course of 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, as decades go on, eventually you're going to get a mutation in a part of a gene that's oncogenic. So cancer takes many decades to develop, right? So you want to make sure your DNA repair enzymes are working properly. That way you don't increase the chance of getting that potential oncogenic mutation. There's been a variety of studies looking at magnesium intake and cancer risk. So one study found that for every 100 milligram decrease in magnesium intake, there was a 24% increase in pancreatic cancer incidence. And this was dose dependent, which really strengthens observational data because you're seeing for each 100 milligram decrease, it continues to go up and up and up. So it's in a dose dependent manner. There's been other studies that have looked at meta-analysis of people and their magnesium intake. People with the highest magnesium intake have a 40% lower all-cause mortality and a 50% lower cancer-related mortality. Again, DNA repair enzymes need magnesium to function properly. So what is, how do you know if you're getting enough magnesium? So unfortunately, unlike vitamin D, which is a pretty simple test, if you're measuring magnesium in plasma, it's not a really good indicator of your magnesium status because your plasma tightly regulates magnesium levels and it pulls magnesium out of your bones to make sure it maintains those levels. And so pulling magnesium out of your bones is like pulling from your retirement fund early because magnesium in your bones is important for bone health. And so much like calcium, if you start to pull magnesium out of your bones over decades because you're not getting enough magnesium from your diet, it leads to osteoporosis, another age-related disease. And so red blood cell tests of magnesium are a little bit better, but unfortunately, the really best way is to really just figure out how much you're getting from your diet, ballpark it. And supplementation is also an option. You want to find supplements that are organic ions. You want to do the organic salts. So that would be magnesium malate, citrate, or magnesium glycinate. Those are much more bioavailable than the inorganic ones, like magnesium chloride, for example. Okay, I want to shift gears and talk about another micronutrient, or in this case, there's kind of three of them. There are 3 fatty acids. The omega-3 fatty acids. And these are pretty commonly, it's like 99% of like the American population does not get enough omega-3 from their diet. And there was a study that was published out of Harvard that actually specifically identified the marine sources of omega-3. So this is EPA and DHA, which are coming from fish. This is compared to the plant source of omega-3, ALA, which is found in things like walnuts or flax seeds or chia seeds. So the marine sources, EPA and DHA, were identified as one of the top 6 preventable causes of death, up there with avoiding trans fats, with avoiding smoking, with avoiding hypertension. So these were all identified as the top 6 preventable causes of death. So not getting enough EPA and DHA from fish and seafood was calculated to be responsible for about 84,000 deaths a year. That was comparable to avoiding trans fats. So everyone knows about trans fats. You walk into a grocery store, every food package you can find is 0 trans fat, 0 trans fat. But what people don't realize is that not getting omega-3 from seafood sources or the marine sources is also detrimental to health, just like eating trans fats is. And it's a really different way of looking at nutrition. And I like this mentality where you're looking at what do I need to get from my food to run my metabolism, to run my brain, to run everything in my body, versus what do I need to avoid? Because when you think about what you need, you end up avoiding all the other processed stuff. It just happens, right? So how do you know if you're getting enough omega-3? Well, the omega-3 index test was developed by my friend, Dr. Bill Harris, and his colleague, Clemens von Schacke, back in 2004. This measures omega-3 in red blood cells. Measuring omega-3 in red blood cells is a long-term marker of omega-3 status because red blood cells take about 120 days to turn over, versus measuring it in plasma phospholipids, which is more of an indicator of your dietary intake in the last couple of weeks. So you can kind of think of it like fasting blood glucose level is your fasting blood glucose level is your glucose levels right now, versus HbA1c, which is your long-term sort of marker of your blood glucose levels, right? Same thing here with omega-3. Well, they identified the omega-3 index, people that have a high omega-3 index that's indicated as an 8% or higher, had a 90% reduction in sudden cardiac death compared to people that had a 4% omega-3. So that would be considered a low omega-3 index. 90% reduction in sudden cardiac death. Heart disease is the #1 killer in the United States and pretty much every developed country. Okay, so another study also done by Bill and his colleagues. This was looking at the Framingham data and looking at the omega-3 index levels. And they found that people, again, with that 8% omega-3 index, the high omega-3 index, had a 5-year increased life expectancy compared to people with the low omega-3 index of 4%. That's a pretty big difference. And if you think about it, it's interesting. In Japan, the omega-3 index is on average 10%, so they're well above the high. In the US, the omega-3 index is about 5% because people aren't eating seafood every day like they do in Japan. And the life expectancy is about 4 to 5 years longer in Japan versus the United States. It's kind of an interesting correlation there. But what I thought was so astounding from this study was Bill and his colleagues had looked at the omega-3 index in smokers versus non-smokers. And people that had the highest, so people that had the longest life expectancy were obviously the non-smokers with a high omega-3 index. People with the lowest life expectancy were the smokers with a low omega-3 index. But if you look at the orange and the blue graph overlay, the smokers with a low omega-3 index had the exact life expectancy as the non-smokers with a high omega-3 index. In other words, not having a high omega-3 index was like smoking in terms of life expectancy. It's just mind-blowing how perfectly overlaid those two populations of people are. And again, comes down to that Harvard study identifying one of the top preventable causes of death is not getting enough of the marine sources of omega-3 from our diet. So in summary of the micronutrient part of this talk, how do we figure out, again, if we're getting enough omega-3, getting your omega-3 levels measured, you want to make sure it's a red blood cell test. Figuring out if you're low, how do I get to the 8% range? Well, Bill also did some of those studies. They did some randomized controlled trials, found that people that have a 4% omega-3 index can get to 8% if they supplement with about 2 grams of omega-3 per day. And how do you find an omega-3 supplement that's high quality? There's a lot of third-party testing sites out there that do so. I have a free guide you can find that gives you a list of how to find those companies, also a list of some of the brands that I've identified from third-party testing that are free of contaminants and have a high concentration of EPA and DHA. It's a free guide, so you guys can find that as well if you just Google my name and omega-3 guide. Vitamin D we talked about, so getting a blood test is essential. You want to be 30 to 60 nanograms per milliliter, and supplementation with about 4,000 IUs a day gets most people to that status. And then with magnesium, increasing your intake of dark leafy greens from the diet. Also, a magnesium red blood cell test is another way to indicate whether or not you're extremely deficient. I think people that are highly athletic and sweating a lot, it's a good idea to get the red blood cell magnesium test because you may find that you're actually magnesium deficient. So that can really sort of shed some light on that. Supplementation is also an option as well. A variety of supplements out there that are organic salts like magnesium malate, glycinate, and citrate. Okay, so now I wanted to go to probably the most important part of my talk, which is that vigorous exercise really is the most powerful longevity drug we have right now at our disposal. In fact, there was a study that just came out, it was published like last week, I think, that found exercise intensity, not the volume of exercise, was the driver of longevity. So people that were doing intense, vigorous exercise. So what does that mean? That's the kind of exercise where you really can't talk when you're working out. You know, most people are about over 80% their max heart rate, probably about 85 to 95% of their max heart rate. You can't talk while you're exercising. Well, those people had a 30% lower all-cause mortality compared to people that were doing low or moderate intensity exercise and were still meeting the requirements and had a larger volume of exercise. They had about a 15% lower all-cause mortality. And when you looked at cardiovascular-related mortality, it was only exercise intensity that mattered. So in other words, we need to get our heart rate up high enough that we can't talk at least a couple times a week, right? And we need to engage in that vigorous intensity exercise. So let's talk about that. Starting with cardiorespiratory fitness. So cardiorespiratory fitness is probably one of the top biomarkers of, I would say, longevity. It's measured as VO2 max. This is the maximum amount of oxygen you take in during maximal exercise. A variety of studies have looked at cardiorespiratory fitness and life expectancy and all-cause mortality. People with a low cardiorespiratory fitness are the ones that benefit the most. So going from a low to anywhere above that is highly beneficial. You go from a low cardiorespiratory fitness for your age group, for your gender, just going into like a low normal. So being normal, even on the low end, you're getting about a 2.1 increase in life expectancy. Going from low to high normal, you can get almost a 3-year increase in life expectancy. And then going from low into the sort of top 5% for your age and gender for cardiorespiratory fitness, that's where you get about a 5-year increase in life expectancy. And so there's been a calculation that's done for every 1 unit increase in your VO2 max and your cardiorespiratory fitness. This is associated with a 45-day extension in life expectancy. And that keeps going up. So 1 more unit, 45 days, 1 more unit, 45 days, right? And it adds up. There was a pretty important study published in JAMA a few years back that claimed really there didn't seem to be an upper limit in terms of the mortality reduction as you increase your cardiorespiratory fitness, as you increase your VO2 max, at least within the groups measured. And so what this study did was looked again at different levels of cardiorespiratory fitness. People that were in the elite group, so these are the elite athletes, they're in the top 2%, they had a 80% lower all-cause mortality than people in the low cardiorespiratory fitness group, 80%. They also still, these elite athletes had a 20% lower all-cause mortality than people that had a high VO2 max. So there's still people that have a high cardiorespiratory fitness are doing great, but when you get to that elite level, you're still benefiting from it. But what I thought was so important from this study was that people with a low cardiorespiratory fitness, so these were people that were identified as quote unquote healthy. They hadn't been identified to have any diseases. They don't have hypertension or diabetes. They don't have cardiovascular disease. They don't have any of these diseases that we consider unhealthy, except for the fact that they're sedentary, which is a disease. And in fact, the people that were in the low cardiorespiratory group had the same all-cause mortality as people with heart disease, as people that were smoking, as people that had type 2 diabetes. In other words, it's time to have this paradigm shift where we don't think of people that are sedentary as healthy, because sedentarism is a disease. Not being physically active is a disease that will age you and will increase your mortality risk. So the question is, how do you improve cardiorespiratory fitness? And that's where we're getting back to the vigorous intensity exercise. It's pretty undeniable. Any sort of aerobic exercise is going to improve your cardiorespiratory fitness. But if you want to really improve it, then you need to engage in vigorous intensity exercise. And again, that's the kind of exercise where you can't talk while you are working out. Okay, this is the hard stuff. This is the effort. And we know it's important because a variety of people that meet the guidelines of 150 minutes per week or 2.5 hours of aerobic exercise per week, where they're doing low to moderate intensity. They can talk while they're exercising, right? 40% of those people still can't improve their cardiorespiratory fitness. They're called non-responders. But when you take those non-responders and then you put them into a vigorous, high-intensity exercise group, they then are able to improve their VO2 max. They're able to improve their cardiorespiratory fitness. Just again, driving home the importance of engaging in vigorous intensity exercise. So what are some of the best protocols to do that? Well, there's a variety of protocols out there. You want to basically get anything you can. So, even if you're doing something like a 30-second interval or a 20-second interval or a Tabata, 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off, like anything where you're really getting that vigorous intensity exercise is going to be beneficial. But what's really beneficial is longer intervals. So if you can at least do a minute as high as you can intensity. One of the best ways, at least evidence-based ways to improve VO2 max and your cardiorespiratory fitness is what's called the Norwegian 4x4 interval. Sometimes it's called the clinical method in studies. It was developed in Norway. A lot of the Norwegian cross-country skiers have some of the most elite cardiorespiratory fitness out there. And they do this type of training. So they do 4 minutes at the highest intensity they can maintain for that 4 minutes. Typically, sometimes it's 85 to 95% of their max heart rate. Obviously, if you've never done this before, you have to progressively work your way there. You can't start that right away, right out the gate. You have to kind of progressively get there. But you want to do as high as you can for 4 minutes, and then you have a light exercise recovery for 3 minutes, and you do that 4 times. So the 4x4 protocol. How do you measure your VO2 max? Well, basically, if you want to go do that, the best way is to actually have it measured. There's a variety of labs that can do that. If that's not an option for you, there is a pretty good evidence-based way of measuring VO2 max, and that is the 12-minute run test, where you want to find a flat track field, some kind of flat surface where you can run as fast as you can and maintain a good speed for the entire 12 minutes. And then you can go do this calculation that you can look up online called the Cooper test, you just look up the 12-minute run test, and there's a calculation. You can also wear your Apple Watch or your device as well, and it kind of does a similar calculation as well if you're doing that. But it's important to have a flat surface because the hills and stuff will definitely make a difference, and it won't be accurate in terms of measuring your VO2 max indirectly. So vigorous exercise, and this is probably one of my favorite studies. This came out of UT Southwest in Dallas by a friend of mine, Dr. Ben Levine. Vigorous intensity exercise was able to reverse cardiac aging. So as we age, the structure of our heart changes. So it gets smaller and stiffer. And this affects the function of our heart. So our heart is unable to pump blood to our tissues as effectively and efficiently as it does when it's younger. It affects our ability to improve cardiorespiratory fitness. It affects our exercise capacity. It affects our cardiovascular disease risk. And there's a variety of reasons why it shrinks and gets stiffer as we age. We're not going to go into all of that. But what Ben and his group did was they took people that were 50 years old that, again, were pretty much sedentary. So they had one disease, they were sedentary, but they hadn't had any other identifiable diseases. And he put these people on a 2-year exercise program. It was a progressive program because you can't get people doing the Norwegian 4x4, as they said, on day 1, so they had to work their way up there. The first 6 months, they were sort of training and working their way up. By the time they got to 6 months, they were exercising like 5 hours a week, and they were doing the Norwegian 4x4 once a week. And they did this for the remainder of the year and a half. And after the 2 years, their structure and function of their hearts looked like 30-year-olds, not 50-year-olds. So they effectively reverse the aging, at least if you're looking at the structure of the heart, by like 20 years, which is pretty incredible that you can take a 50-year-old who's been sedentary, put them on a pretty intense exercise program for 2 years, and show that their hearts can now look like a 30-year-old heart versus a 50-year-old heart, right? So I really think that the bottom line here is it's never too late to start exercising. But then the other question is, well, what if you even start earlier? Like all the other benefits, right? And there's so many benefits. Blood pressure benefits, so vigorous intensity exercise, doing 3 to 4 days per week of about 20 to 60 minutes of more higher intensity exercise can have similar effects as anti-hypertensive treatment. So these are drug-sized effects. Hypertension affects 50% of Americans, 20% of people that are age 18 to 29. I mean, that's incredible. Young people, they have hypertension. So exercise is really a panacea. And I want to talk about why, one of the reasons, there's actually many, but one of the reasons that vigorous intensity exercise is so incredibly important. And it has to do with the metabolite that's made. So when you push your muscles to work really hard, harder than and faster than you can get oxygen that you breathe in to them, then they're forced to make energy without oxygen. And the way they do that is by using glucose without the mitochondria. And so they make energy using glucose, and lactate is a metabolite that's also made. It's called glycolysis. Well, lactate is more than a metabolite. A friend of mine, Dr. George Brooks, he's actually down the street at UC Berkeley. He, I don't know how many, over a decade ago, like maybe 2 decades ago, identified lactate as a signaling molecule, and at the time it was called the lactate shuttle hypothesis. It's no longer a hypothesis. Many studies have proven it, but lactate gets shuttled out of your muscle, gets into circulation, and it goes into the brain. It goes to the heart, it goes to the kidneys, it goes to the liver. And it's a way that your muscle is communicating with these other organs. You know, our body wants to maintain status quo. It wants to kind of just stay the same. And so we have all these homeostasis mechanisms where if we stress our body in some way, our body has feedback loops that respond and adapt because it's trying to make things stay the same. And lactate is one of the communicating ways that our body does that. Well, lactate, when it gets into the brain, signals and activates something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. This is a growth factor in our brain that increases the growth of new neurons. It does it in the hippocampus. It is involved in neuroplasticity, so it increases neuroplasticity. This is the ability of our brain to change and adapt to our changing environment, very important as we age. It increases learning, memory, a lot of things, very, very important. And if you want to think of a sensational way to explain BDNF, it's like a youth elixir for our brain. Lactate's activating it, and the way we get that is by vigorous intensity exercise. You have to push past that comfort zone to get there. Lactate has also been shown in human studies, these are human studies, to increase neurotransmitters like serotonin, and serotonin also plays a role in neurogenesis and growing new brain cells, specifically after exercise. It's also a neurotransmitter that's involved in mood and memory, but also impulse control. And so there's been some human studies looking at more lower intensity exercise versus more vigorous intensity exercise, and people that do the vigorous intensity exercise have more lactate, and they have more serotonin, and they have improved impulse control after the workout. So a lot of reason for mental health, for cognitive health, for brain aging to engage in vigorous intensity exercise. There's a lot of protocols out there for increasing BDNF. These are, trials that have been done in humans. Really, it does seem like the sweet spot is you have to get that vigorous intensity. Even 20 minutes has been shown to do it, but like getting the real big burst of it it's about 30 minutes of at least 80% max heart rate. So again, you're not able to talk very much, maybe a couple of words, but you're not really able to talk much while you're working out. There's a lot of protocols out there. You can look them up. 6 minutes at high intensity, it's kind of like a more all out, that can increase BDNF levels by 4 to 5 times versus baseline. So vigorous intensity exercise, great for BDNF, great for the brain. But there's also a reason to engage in vigorous intensity exercise in terms of cancer prevention and cancer treatment. So when we think of cancer metastasis, when we think of like tumor cells escaping the site of a tumor, getting in circulation, making their way to another distant organ, people that have cancer often are told to relax and exercise, not exercise, to relax, just to sit and recover, right? And actually, that's the exact opposite of what science and evidence shows that should be done. So these circulating tumor cells that do escape the site of the tumor and get into circulation, if you engage in exercise, and there's studies that have shown this, the more intense the exercise, the quicker the blood flow is going through your blood vessels. And that creates what's called a shearing force, and it causes circulating tumor cells to die. They can't make their way to another organ. And again, the more intense the exercise, the more vigorous the exercise, the greater the effect. Circulating tumor cells are associated with I think it's about a 3 times higher risk of cancer recurrence and a 4 times higher risk of cancer mortality. 6 months of aerobic exercise actually reduced circulating tumor cells in patients with stage 1 to stage 3 colon cancer. And again, that really is having an effect on their cancer recurrence, their cancer mortality. Another study that looked at stage 3 colon cancer patients that engaged in aerobic exercise, they had a 40% reduction in their disease recurrence and a 60% reduction in their mortality rate. So again, just every reason to engage in exercise. Exercise also prevents cancer as well. There's a lot of studies out there showing that people that are engaging in aerobic exercise and vigorous intensity exercise have a lower cancer incidence and obviously a lower cancer mortality as well. So we're talking about all this vigorous exercise. What if you don't have 20 or 30 or 40 minutes to get this really intense vigorous exercise program on? Let's talk a little bit about exercise snacks. So these are really short, 1 to 2 minute bursts of intense physical activity. They can be structured, so they can be things where you're doing body weight squats. They can be things where you're doing high knees, a little sprint, a variety of ways that you can do these types of exercises. These exercises have been shown. In fact, there was a study that was published a couple months ago that found people that did 10 body weight squats every 45 minutes during their 8-hour work week improved their blood glucose regulation better than people that went on a 30-minute walk. So it takes me about 27 seconds to do 10 body weight squats. So you think about that, that's very time efficient, right? 27 seconds every 45 minutes. And you break up your sedentary time, which we're going to talk about as well. Doing your exercise snacks around mealtime. So this has been shown in a variety of studies, particularly people that are metabolically dysregulated, type 2 diabetes. If they do an exercise snack, just a brief burst of 10 body weight squats, 20 body weight squats around mealtime, within an hour of mealtime, it's more effective than again, more of a longer continuous exercise at regulating blood glucose levels. So it's a really effective protocol. I mean, anyone can get up and just do a minute of body weight squats or high knees or something. And the reason it's so effective is, again, because of lactate. When you cross over that intensity threshold, you're making more lactate. Yeah, get ready, it's coming. You're making more lactate. And again, lactate is shuttling to other tissues, but it's also going back to the muscle. And it's causing our glucose transporters, GLUT4 transporters, to come up to the muscle cell to help bring in glucose. And again, it's part of that adaptation. When you're working vigorously, you're using more glucose, and your body's like, I need more glucose to make energy. And so it finds a way to do it. And the lactate's the way to communicate that way to do it, right? Lactate's increasing those glucose transporters, those GLUT4 transporters. The high intensity exercise is also really important for metabolic health via mitochondria. So mitochondria, as many of you guys know, they're in most of our cells with the exception of red blood cells. They are very important for aging. They're the major source of energy in most of our cells. We don't have a repair system in our mitochondria similar like we do. We do have a repair system, but there's no repair system like DNA repair. Like there's no way to repair mitochondrial DNA. We have our own mitochondrial genome. You make DNA in mitochondria, it's produced there, you make some proteins there. Proteins are also imported in. But the way mitochondria repair themselves is through a process called mitophagy and fission and fusion. So you have a mitochondria that's damaged, and it can sort of fizz apart, and the damaged part can cleave off, and you can then recycle that damaged part through this process known as mitophagy, very similar to autophagy, where you're recycling damaged parts of the cell. Well, mitophagy is activated through intense exercise, and this has been shown in human studies. Again, it was exercise intensity that was very important. 30 minutes of vigorous intensity exercise increased mitophagy, and this was totally independent of fasting. So people that had fasted for 16 hours or did not fast at all had the same amount of mitophagy. Again, it was the intense exercise that was activating the mitophagy process. And so what happens is you end up getting rid of damaged parts of your mitochondria so that you have healthier, younger, more vibrant mitochondria left. Well, high-intensity exercise, vigorous intensity exercise also increases the growth of new mitochondria in your muscle cells. There's some animal evidence that it also does it in the brain. I don't know why the mechanism would be any different. But again, this comes down to lactate. So vigorous intensity exercise causes your muscles to make lactate. Lactate then signals to a very important gene and protein, PGC1 alpha, that increases the growth of new mitochondria, mitochondrial biogenesis. And so what ends up happening is not only are you getting rid of damaged mitochondria, then you're replacing them with new healthy mitochondria. And so it's kind of this rejuvenation way of just getting rid of bad mitochondria and bringing in new healthy young mitochondria. Again, this is in muscle cells in humans. Animal studies have shown this happens in brain and neurons as well. I tend to think that that would be conserved, especially because lactate seems to be regulating that process as well. And back to this concept of the exercise snacks, so we talked about improving metabolic health, timing it around meal times. Well, there's also been a variety of studies by Martin Gabala, who's a friend of mine. He's been on my podcast as well. He's done a variety of studies with his colleagues looking at this unstructured type of exercise snack. So this is called the vigorous intermittent lifestyle physical activity, or VILPA. And these are people that aren't necessarily doing their bodyweight squats. They are in their office, and they, instead of walking or taking the elevator or walking up the stairs, they sprint up the stairs every day. They sprint down the stairs, or if they walk to work, they're not just walking, they're interval sprinting. So these are people that are sort of taking advantage of everyday life situations to get their heart rate up. And so there's been large studies, and there's been more than one, where these people are wearing accelerometers, and so researchers can track the intensity of their exercise. And what's been shown is that people that engage in 1 to 2 minutes of intense physical activity 3 times a day, these people have about a 40% reduction in all-cause mortality and in cancer-related mortality, and a 50% reduction in cardiovascular-related mortality by just doing 1 to 2 minutes of vigorous intensity exercise 3 times a day. And this was also found in people that identify themselves as non-exercisers. So these are people that don't consider themselves physically active because they don't go to the gym or they don't engage in leisure time physical activity. So their benefits were still there, just doing those short bursts of physical activity. So there's a lot of ways that you can implement this. These 2 gentlemen right here were leading the way. You can do high knees, you can do some, jump squats or body weight squats, lunges, sprinting, anything that you want. And it's really important because sedentary, like as we're sitting here for, let's see, we've been sitting here for 30 minutes since I got up on stage. As you're sitting throughout your workday for 8 hours, being sedentary is an independent risk factor for cancer, meaning like even if you engage in physical activity, it's still an independent risk factor. And so it's really good to try to break up your workday, to break up your sedentary time with a short burst of exercise. And that's really easy to do. In fact, we're all gonna get up right now and do it. We're gonna just do 1 minute instead of 2. But I think, I'm still sore from my squats. Let's do high knees. Let's get our heart rate up. So we're gonna do high knees for 1 minute. Are you ready? And really try to get your heart rate up. Set, go. All right, so try high knees, move your hands. Everyone. But the other benefit is that you feel better. You're getting blood flow to your brain. You're going to function better. I mean, there's been studies that 10 minutes of intense physical activity improves cognition, learning, memory. So, all the reasons to do exercise snacks. Okay. Very briefly, I want to just shift gears and talk about sleep. This last part of my talk here, as I mentioned, sleep is so important for a variety of physiological functions that are important for longevity and the way we age, right? I'm just going to talk about metabolic health here, but brain health, immune health, cardiovascular health. It's an important topic because about 1/3 of the American population gets less than the recommended 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night, 7 being the minimum. Even just getting 1 hour less of sleep per night for like 3 days in a row or 3 nights in a row can actually cause acute insulin resistance in otherwise healthy adults. Increase fasting insulin levels, higher insulin concentrations, decrease insulin sensitivity. Again, even just 1 hour less of sleep per night over the course of 3 nights. So this is called sleep debt, right? Where you start to have 1 to maybe 3 less hours of sleep per night. You start to build this up over 3 nights, 4 nights. This is called sleep debt. And so when you start to get sleep debt, again, in otherwise healthy adults, that leads to a 40% slower glucose clearance, 30% decrease in glucose effectiveness, that's similar to diabetes, 30% lower insulin response. I noticed this about 7 years ago when I became a new mom, where I was wearing my continuous glucose monitor, and it was very obvious my glucose system was completely dysregulated. It was shocking to me. So getting less than 7 hours of sleep per night, there's been meta-analysis done. It's been shown that people that are getting less than 7 hours sleep per night have a much, much higher risk of type 2 diabetes. Again, their glucose regulation's out of control. They have higher HbA1c levels, so that's the long-term marker for blood glucose levels. And if they're getting less than 6 hours, they also have an increased risk of visceral fat. But the high HbA1c is one I want to highlight, because when you have high HbA1c, this means that you're having higher elevated glucose levels over the course of basically your life, right? Depending on how often you measure it. What happens and what that means in terms of aging and the way your cardiovascular health is, so glucose, if you have it sitting around, if it's not clearing out and it's not going into your muscles, right? What happens is it starts to form through a Maillard reaction, advanced glycation end products. They're called AGEs. And what these do is they cross-link collagen, they cross-link proteins, they cross-link DNA, lipids, but collagen in particular and proteins, it does it in the vascular system. It does it in the myocardium, in the pericardium where collagen is. And what happens over time is that leads to the stiffness. That stiffness of the heart I was talking about, largely from dysregulated glucose metabolism. And also in the vascular system, so that leads to decreased vascular compliance, high blood pressure. So having high HbA1c is very, very bad for cardiovascular health and increases the risk for cardiovascular disease. There are a variety of mechanisms by which, how loss of sleep, how not getting enough sleep can increase metabolic disease, can increase type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, decreased insulin signaling in your adipocytes, so in your fat cells, lower beta cell sensitivity to glucose. There's changes in satiety hormones and impaired glucose absorption in your muscle and liver. You probably already figured out one solution to that, which we're going to get to in a minute. But all that can lead to insulin resistance. There's been some studies looking at people that are short sleepers or don't get enough sleep and improving their sleep and how that affects their metabolic health. So one of the staples of improving people's sleep is a good sleep hygiene. Many of you guys probably know this. A lot of factors here. One is using light smartly. So you want to get early morning bright light exposure. This resets your circadian rhythm so that it knows when to start making melatonin, that hormone you produce in your pineal gland later at night. It knows when it starts making it at the right time, so you start to get sleepy at the right time. So this resetting of the circadian rhythm by early bright light exposure. Dr. Sachin Panda has talked a lot about this over the years. He's a chronobiologist, also a really good friend of mine. He's been on my podcast many times talking about early bright light exposure and how important that is for resetting the circadian rhythm, but also avoiding bright blue light in the evening. Again, a lot of work from Dr. Sachin Panda. Blue light, it inhibits the production of melatonin. So you just want to make sure you're using light smartly. Body temperature, managing your room temperature is important. So cooling is not just about being comfortable. There's a circadian component to it as well. your body, when it's cooled down, again, it's the circadian component, the clock, where it's nighttime, it's rest time, and everything kind of shuts down and falls into place like it should. Meal timing is another one. Again, Dr. Sachin Panda has talked a lot about this on my podcast. He's also got several publications where you want to stop eating meals about 3 hours before your bedtime, because you don't want to be digesting during sleep. You also don't want to be doing it because you're not going to be regulating your blood glucose levels efficiently, and things like that as well. But it does affect sleep. Regular exercise helps. And then monitoring your caffeine intake. You don't want to be taking in caffeine too close to bedtime, because it shifts your circadian rhythm by about 45 minutes per cup. So there's been some evidence-based ways that have looked at people that are short sleepers, that have metabolic dysregulation, doing something called sleep extension. So that means adjusting your bedtimes where you get into bed earlier or you sleep in later. Anything to help you, get that 7 hours of sleep. Sleep hygiene is a big part of that. Those people can, if they increase their sleep by 1 hour a night, they can improve their insulin sensitivity, their hormones and their appetite regulation gets back in place. They actually end up losing weight and consuming almost like 300 calories fewer a day. So basically what happens is their satiety hormones are now in check, and so they're not eating more, and they're again losing weight because they're eating fewer calories. And then the same goes for cognitive behavioral therapy. This is for people with insomnia. So CBTI is one of the most, I would say, evidence-based ways to improve insomnia in people that have it. And it has a variety of factors associated with it. I'm not going to get into all of them. But there is meta-analyses looking at people that have insomnia, do CBTI, and then looks at their metabolic health. And they have improved HbA1c, they have improved blood pressure, improved sleep quality and sleep duration. So all these things go along. Just more evidence of it's not just bad news, right? Okay, yeah, you have poor sleep, you're not sleeping well, you're metabolically dysregulated, but if you can improve that sleep, guess what? Your metabolic health falls back into place as well. Now, what if you were like me, a new mom, and it's like, oh, that's all well and good, but I can't sleep longer because I got to feed my kid, right? My baby. You're waking up, you got to care for someone. So there's good news, okay? And it comes back to vigorous intensity exercise. There have been a few studies that have looked at people that either engage in high intensity interval training while they're undergoing the sleep restriction. Again, it helps improve glucose tolerance, it helps improve mitochondrial function, mitochondrial proteins, but also it improves the acute insulin resistance that occurs from the sleep restriction. And this is something that I did find, again, as well when I was wearing my continuous glucose monitor and I started doing my high intensity interval training, where it was almost back to normal, pretty darn close. So even doing it before, even doing high intensity interval training before you're going to have sleep restriction. So it's really important to engage in that vigorous intensity exercise. There's a lot of protocols out there. We talked about some of them, the Tabata, the 4x4. I mean, choose whatever you're going to do and that you like to do. And then lastly, I just want to mention this one last study, which is people that are getting either too little sleep, so less than 7 hours, or too much sleep, so they're getting greater than 9 hours. Those people have a higher all-cause mortality, but only if they're not physically active. If they were physically active and they were meeting the guidelines, either 75 minutes a week of intense high-intensity exercise, vigorous exercise, or 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise a week, they had the same mortality risks as someone who was getting normal sleep. So again, exercise is a panacea. It forgives a lot of sins, maybe all, maybe not, but a lot. And there's every reason to engage in exercise, to engage in intense physical activity. I would say that number two, let's talk about that because we're on exercise. I think you need to think, it's important to think about exercise as a part of your life, like you wake up in the morning and you brush your teeth. It's not something you add on if you have time. It's the wrong way to think about it. You have to do it. You have to do it. If you're tired, if you didn't get sleep, you have to wake up and do it. It's part of your life. You don't go to bed. You don't get up without brushing your teeth. You brush your teeth. You have to exercise. Make it part of your routine. Do something that you're going to do and enjoy doing and will do. You're not always going to enjoy doing the vigorous intensity exercise, but you will after you're done. You're going to feel great. You're going to feel like you accomplished something. And it's going to improve the way you age. There's no doubt about it, period. Avoiding the key deficiencies, we talked about that, omega-3 index test, the magnesium intake, low vitamin D, and then optimizing for sleep, very important. You can engage in some of these evidence-based protocols for improving sleep, including the sleep extension or CBTI, but at the end of the day, there's always exercise as well that saves us. And that's it. Thank you so much, you guys. It's been awesome.